UFC 309, Jones versus Miocic. The UFC heads to MSG tomorrow for what could be Jon Jones' last fight ever, last fight at heavyweight. Who knows? We're going to talk about it, but before that, we got to go and break down the rest of this card here, starting off with Veronica Hardy versus Eduarda Moura. Moura is coming off of a loss to Diniz Gomes, who I think is one of the more talented fighters in the division. She was 10-0 going into that fight, so pretty highly touted. She strikes me as a bit one-dimensional. If she can't take you down, she can get a bit frustrated. Veronica Hardy is going to be a tough matchup for her because I think she has pretty strong grappling, good wrestling as well. She's on a 3-fight win streak. I think she's going to win this one by decision over Eduarda Moura. Veronica Hardy is the pick there. Next is Bassil Hafez taking on Oban Elliott. Hafez is coming off a win over Gall. That fight did not go as I expected. I think most people were anticipating Hafez to just kind of climb on his back, get a submission. That's not how it played out. It honestly happened pretty much entirely on the feet. He had to win it with his hands, show off his boxing a little bit, and I felt he did that. Didn't have the most finesse, most skill, but he showed quite a bit of power, had Gall hurt a couple times there. Oban Elliott is going to be the cleaner guy. I think he's going to have the much better gas tank. It hasn't been seriously tested in the UFC yet, but I like his odds versus Bassil Hafez. Obviously, Hafez could implement the grappling a bit, but I think that's going to be tough. And if he goes for some takedowns and gets stuff, it's going to be really tough for him. I think that gas tank is going to be a big issue. Oban Elliott, by decision, is going to be the pick there. Next up is Gall versus Ramiz Brahimaj. Gall did look pretty solid versus Bassil Hafez. Had Hafez hurt a few times. I felt he was probably the more technical striker in that matchup. Landed some clean strikes, but just doesn't really have the power to really turn that fight in his favor. Brahimaj has a pretty up-and-down UFC career. He's kind of hovering around 500. Gall, on the other hand, is pretty much a career 500 fighter, 7-6 overall. I just can't really trust that record of Gall. I'm going to take Brahimaj by decision in this one. Yeah, that one's a pretty tough one to pick there. Next up in the heavyweight division, we have Marcin Tybura taking on Jhonata Diniz. Diniz, honestly, I think is one of the least talked about prospects in the UFC. More underappreciated prospects. Obviously, he's 33 years old, has had a pretty lengthy career of kickboxing behind him, but only, I believe, 8-0 in MMA. But I see a lot of promise with him. He's got a lot of power, clean striking. I think his striking is already above 95% of the division. He's taking on Marcin Tybura, who's obviously has grappling ability, can frustrate Jhonata Diniz. Diniz did get taken down by Carl Williams in his most recent fight, but that was after he beat on Williams for pretty much the entire fight leading up to that. Power really is everything in my eyes. I mean, if Tybura takes him down, I think he's going to need a finish because, especially if it's in like the first round, I think Diniz is going to come out in the second round and be looking to deal a lot of damage to Tybura that he's just not going to be able to return. I think Diniz eventually finds a KO versus Marcin Tybura here. Next up is a featherweight matchup between David Onama and Roberto Romero. Romero is a pretty recent addition to this card. He's a short notice fighter here. He's only 24 years old, and from what I've seen, he looks pretty decent. But Onama is such a tough draw for your UFC debut. I think he's going to give him a lot of issues on the feet. Tall guy, pretty good length, and a lot of power. I think Onama just finds the KO in this one. Romero on a full camp in preparation for Onama maybe could make it a little bit more interesting. I think this one ends pretty quick. Next up, we have Jim Miller versus Damon Jackson. Jim Miller obviously just got beat up pretty bad by King Green. Speed was a major issue in that fight. I mean, Green's hands were just so much faster. It wasn't even, it looked like they were fighting at two different speeds. That being said, Damon Jackson's a much different opponent. Not nearly the level of striker that King Green is. I think he'll honestly have the heavier hands than Damon Jackson and the cleaner boxing as well. Jim Miller's looking to build on his record for most wins in UFC history. Damon Jackson, another older guy, so it's not like he's coming up against some young gun. And I just don't see him having the same speed disadvantage he did versus King Green. I think Jim Miller builds on his record versus Damon Jackson, wins this one by decision. Up next is a middleweight fight between Chris Weidman and Eryk Anders. Pretty much going to probably be Weidman's retirement fight here. He's coming off of a super weird fight versus Bruno Silva, a fight that he won, but it was strange. It was kind of marred by eye pokes and just a bunch of just nonsense happening. He's got a pretty ideal matchup here, though, versus Eryk Anders, who I believe is making his middleweight debut, or this is only his second fight at middleweight. Neither of these guys are really too dangerous. I think this one is going to be pretty slow-paced. We could see one of these guys get a takedown. I think as far as matchups go, this is as good as it's going to get for Chris Weidman at this stage in his career. Eryk Anders, I think he's shown promise in the past, but he just has a bad habit of just not really being aggressive, not really taking many chances. I think Weidman wins this one by decision. I think he's going to have to just land more punches here, be able to kind of bully Eryk Anders up on the cage and win the fight that way. Next fight is a super interesting bantamweight matchup between Jonathan Martinez and Marcus McGhee. McGhee has jumped out to a bit of a favorite on the betting lines in this one. For me, the biggest separator between these two in this matchup is going to be the hands of McGhee. I think these two are pretty evenly matched, all things considered, but if we're talking boxing, Marcus McGhee is going to have the much faster hands, way more power as well. I think Martinez kind of got exposed versus Jose Aldo. Aldo, obviously, super slick boxer, and I'd put his striking up against pretty much anyone in the bantamweight division at this point in time, but Martinez really looked out of place in the stand-up versus Aldo. Didn't really sit on his punches too much. He's a bit afraid to commit, and you saw a serious mismatch in terms of power that I think we're going to see with Marcus McGhee here. I don't think McGee's going to be too scared of what's coming at him. Martinez can definitely get the leg kicks going, and if he can land a few good ones, I think that can make this really interesting. McGhee is a really explosive guy, uses a lot of movement. If he can limit that with some leg kicks, then it could be interesting. But, man, I think McGhee is not going to be too scared of what's coming his way from Martinez's striking, and I think he's going to find his rhythm and honestly find a KO in this one. So McGhee by KO is the pick. Next up is Mauricio Ruffy versus James Llontop. The fighting nerds are absolutely on fire right now. I think the men are all undefeated in the UFC. There's 4 of them, and they have a combined record of, I don't know, is it 20 plus at this point? The guys just are on another level right now. They're doing crazy stuff down in Brazil. I don't really see the winning streak stopping now. I mean, Mauricio Ruffy only had one fight versus Jamie Mullarkey, but it was a total mismatch. He just completely outclassed him on the feet. So much more power. He was just styling on him by the end. James Llontop, honestly, might be worse than Jamie Mullarkey, all things considered. I think Rufus gets a stylish KO in this one. Adds to the highlight reel. Adds to the aura. And, wins this one convincingly. Next up is a matchup between Viviane Araujo and Karine Silva. Karine's been on pretty much a tear since joining the UFC. She's 4-0. Had 3 consecutive submission wins until she got a decision win most recently. Araujo could definitely play spoiler here. She's never been submitted, and she's obviously has the UFC experience edge here. But even when Karine Silva went the distance in her most recent fight, she had like 7 minutes of control time. Her grappling's so strong that a serious path of victory for her is just control it on the ground. She'll take your back if you present it to her. I think this is just a tough matchup for Viviane. Silva, I see winning this one by decision. Next up is Bo Nickal taking on Paul Craig in the middleweight division. A lot of pressure for Bo Nickal in this one. I mean, he's like a 10-1 favorite, but not only does he have to get the win, I think he's got to do it convincingly to shut some people up. A A lot of people are wanting to call fraud on Bo Nickal. Nothing he's done has really surprised me to this point. I'm not going to say he's completely surpassed my expectations of him, but the guy's only had 7 career fights. He's only 28 years old, obviously not super young, but the guy just has not had the cage time to really, I think, develop as much as maybe he would if he was in the amateur circuit for a bit longer and, had more of these tune-up fights. I mean, Paul Craig, for your 8th or 7th, 8th, or 9th career fight, is a super tough matchup. They wouldn't give that matchup to really just anybody. Obviously, Paul Craig, he's not the most dangerous guy at this point, and I see his only path to winning this one being kind of just like a Hail Mary submission that pretty much all of his other big wins have come from. Bo Nickal's just so athletic, so strong, and his grappling is obviously second to none. People looked at that Cody Brundage fight. Cody Brundage is another guy with a pretty legit wrestling pedigree, I'm pretty sure. He had more experience, and people are acting like Bo Nickal lost that fight. Like, the dude submitted Cody Brundage. Obviously, there's like that 5-second clip of Brundage throwing, Bo Nickal off of him. I'm not looking too deep into it. Bo Nickal, I think, is just the far superior athlete, even the better grappler. I think he finds a submission versus Paul Craig in this one. I think he's just going to control Paul Craig and just smother him. And I could see him wrapping up a rear naked choke at some point in this fight. Our co-main event is Charles Oliveira versus Michael Chandler 2. Absolutely electric fight. This one is going to be fireworks. Massive opportunity for Michael Chandler. Honestly, feels like a bigger opportunity for Chandler than Oliveira. Oliveira, I feel like at this point is, he's coming off the loss to Arman Sarukian. It doesn't feel like this would put him quite in line for the title next. And honestly, I'm not sure if fighting for the title is bigger stakes than fighting against Conor McGregor, who that's obviously just a life-changing opportunity. And Chandler's really kind of gambling with that McGregor fight by taking this fight. He got sick of sitting around. I think this was the right move for him. But if he loses here, he can probably kiss that McGregor fight goodbye. But if he gets a win here, I mean, he might be undeniable. That just opens up so many doors for the McGregor matchup. Because then, think about this. If he beats Oliveira and then McGregor beats Michael Chandler, I mean, just imagine. Now you can play the, Conor McGregor would beat Charles Oliveira game. And it just gets... it just really helps his case for booking that fight. But let's get into the matchup. Obviously, first fight was for the belt, and total tale of 2 rounds. I mean, Chandler pretty much dominated the first round. Wobbled Oliveira really bad in the latter half of the round. It felt like he was like 1 or 2 clean shots away from putting Oliveira completely out. But Oliveira is just so good at surviving and just evaded the big shots long enough to just get out of that round and to kind of regain his senses. And then we all know what happened next. They came out in the second round, and Oliveira almost instantly found that left hook and just hit Chandler so clean on the chin. That really was the difference between the two in that matchup. Chandler hit Oliveira a few times, and he was finding home, but he never really found that clean shot that Oliveira did. That all being said, I think Oliveira should not really be too content with how that first fight, with his performance in that first fight. I think he came out a little bit too tentative, kind of let Chandler find his flow early in that matchup, and it almost cost him. I mean, he absolutely was close to getting finished in that fight. And I think if Oliveira comes out lackadaisically at all in this matchup, I mean, he can get put to sleep. Chandler's got that type of power. I think Chandler's going to sell out for the KO early here, and it's a total coin flip. I mean, if he lands, he's going to put him out. If he doesn't really land clean, then obviously the further along this fight goes, it's going to benefit Oliveira. Oliveira has the submission threat. I think if he finds a submission, it's going to be just Chandler's being completely exhausted. It's like 3 minutes into the third round, and Chandler's just completely depleted. But all that being said, we're taking Michael Chandler to win this one by KO. I can't even believe I'm saying this. I'm as big of an Oliveira fan as pretty much anyone. But Chandler's got so much on the line here. All the dude's been doing is just like squatting and doing like box jumps. The dude's going to be super explosive. I think he can shock Oliveira with his speed, and he's just going to come out pedal to the metal, and I think he gets a KO early versus Charles Oliveira. Finally, we have our main event. It is Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic for the heavyweight belt. The greatest of all time versus likely the greatest heavyweight of all time. I mean, listen, I write notes for all these fights. My notes for this are Stipe old, Jon Jones less old. And I hate to dumb it down like that, but that's really kind of how I'm evaluating this. I think if this fight took place 5 years earlier, I mean, Stipe coming off of that last win versus Cormier, Jon Jones around the time of that Dominic Reyes performance. I mean, I remember the discourse, and I was saying, dude, if Jon Jones takes on Stipe right now, I don't think he was winning that fight. I mean, Stipe is going to be a bit bigger. But, alas, we never got that matchup. Now we're getting the matchup 4 years down the road where these guys are kind of at completely different, just times in their careers, times in their lives. Stipe, obviously, you got to think that he's just is not going to be as tuned up as he was back then. His last fight was pretty much 4 years ago, so I just have a hard time seeing Stipe really put on the type of performance you need to knock down a guy like Jon Jones, who's been consistently training, been locked in, been ducking Francis Ngannou. And there's no question, Jon Jones, this is all going, all going towards his master plan, going according to his master plan. I think he planned this whole thing out. Wait out Francis Ngannou. We don't want smoke with that guy. He's huge. Let's take on Stipe, undersized heavyweight, and now let's avoid Tom Aspinall at all costs. So we'll see where we go from here. I think Jones is going to submit Stipe in this one. I think he's just going to be in better shape, better grappling, I think more athletic, and he'll just find a choke at some point. But where do we go from here if Jones wins? I really don't know. I mean, part of me thinks he's, I think he's well aware that every time he, throws shade at Aspinall, ducks an Aspinall question, I mean, he knows that he's just feeding the flame, that people are going to want that fight more. But make no mistake about it, that is a terrible matchup for Jon Jones. I think it'd be smart of him to avoid that at all costs. So who knows? But we'll see. We'll have to reevaluate that after Jon Jones handles business versus Stipe Miocic. But thank you for watching. That is the breakdown. Like, comment, subscribe, all of that. We'll catch you on the next one.